So Ilhan Omar took on prominent neocon Elliot Abrams in a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. Now, Abrams has been picked by Donald Trump to run his Venezuela operation. And for those of you who don't know, Elliot Abrams was a 1980s Cold Warrior, and he was in charge of effectively destroying South America. So, this was during the Cold War. They were afraid of the scourge of communism is going to take over in our hemisphere. We can't allow that. So what do? You go topple democratically elected leaders, put in puppet dictators who will serve U.S. interests. And that's exactly what this guy was the head of. Okay, so it's on record. He's a terrible guy. Talking about him being a war criminal is the same thing as talking about Henry Kissinger being a war criminal. Anybody who's educated on this stuff goes, duh, that's what he is. Well, look at the line of questioning she gave to this Weasley little prick. I love this. Watch.
Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your testimonies. Mr. Adams, in 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question.
That
was not a question. I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
That was not a question. Thank you for your participation. On February 8th, 1982, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about U.S. policy in El Salvador. In that hearing, you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which more than 800 civilians, including children as young as 2 years old, were brutally murdered by U.S.-trained troops. During that massacre, some of those troops bragged about raping a 12-year-old girl before they killed them. Girls before they killed them. You later said that the U.S. policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement. Yes or no, do you still think so?
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and I
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Now, you'll notice he did not answer that last question. That last question was, would you support an armed coup, an armed group committing war crimes in Venezuela if they're backing U.S. interests? And he said, I'm not going to respond to that question. I mean, listen, historically, that's exactly what he's done. So he doesn't answer that question because the answer is yes. Because in his mind, well, the ends justify the means. So, you got to crack a couple eggs to make an omelet. So you got to murder a couple people here, murder a couple people there to get rid of these left-wing evil commies to put in a freedom-loving democracy. Well, then, of course, we got to do what we got to do. But what he doesn't tell you is, again, he backed dictators. Now, let me be specific. He was in charge in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. He backed literal death squads. One of the dictators Efrain Rios Montt was found guilty of overseeing a campaign of mass murder and torture of indigenous people in Guatemala. And the dude was found guilty of genocide. We backed him, we propped him up. In El Salvador, the U.S.-backed forces committed what Ilhan Omar touched on there, which is the El Mazote massacre, killing 500 innocent civilians on purpose. So, again, I need to be clear about this. His history is not up in the air. It's not open to interpretation. It's not open to debate. It's very clear that during the Cold War, the U.S. said, your democratically elected leaders, gone in South America. What we're going to do is we're going to give you democracy, and it was just right-wing puppet dictators. And in order to get to that point, they literally backed death squads, supported mass murderers and torturers. So that's who he is. He's a war criminal in the same way that Henry Kissinger is a war criminal, and now Trump brought him back. And notice something. When somebody actually pushes on their record, they melt. Because all it is, underneath the suit and the veneer of respectability, it's nothing but, let me talk to your managerism. Like, oh, how dare you? It's a young woman of color in hijab telling me that I've done bad things. I refuse to partake in this dog and pony show. Yeah, but we see through you. Ultimate snowflakes. What happened, buddy? If you think your record is that easy to defend, why do you need to pull the "you're being so politically incorrect and I'm now a snowflake" card? Why can't you just say, no, and here, let me walk you through it. Here's why that's wrong. Because you can't do it. Because you know she's right. In the same way Henry Kissinger is a bloodthirsty warmonger, war criminal, neocon, that's what you are. Bloodthirsty, warmonger, war criminal, neocon. That's what your record is. And you can't defend it. And we now, listen, you think they're not planning by any means necessary to take out Maduro in Venezuela? Again, to say nothing about Maduro's leadership, that's not the point here. They will do anything to get that guy out, including the bullshit PR stunt. Remember, one of the things that Elliot Abrams did in the 1980s, he would send this cargo and say, oh, it's humanitarian aid and food, and your people are starving. Here, take our aid. And then what it really was weapons to go to right-wing death squad so they can start a violent coup. That's what he did. That's on the record. That's proven. So what ended up happening as a result of that, and we still see the effects to this day, is now people in third world countries all around the world, they look skeptically at aid groups. In fact, aid groups are the people on the front lines who are screaming at the U.S., stop doing these PR stunts. Stop pretending like you're sending aid and sending weapons. Stop, doing this, because then what happens is they end up being the victims of it, because when they try to actually help people, people are skeptical of them, rightly so, because they think everything is, a secret U.S. plot. Another example of this is in Pakistan, the U.S. did fake vaccinations to try to get intelligence to track down Osama bin Laden. So now people in developing countries are like, do I want to go to this, actual aid group in order to get a vaccine? No, because what if it's the U.S.? And what if they're fucking around again? So they just did it again in Venezuela. We just showed you the story about, oh my God, the bridge has been shut down and Maduro's not letting in aid for his own people. That bridge was never in use. It was never in use. And again, he has a history of sneaking in weapons under the guise of this is humanitarian aid and food. So that's what he did. This guy's legacy, listen, he should be in prison. He really should. And what you've seen here is a great job from Ilhan Omar, because she unmasked how gross Washington, D.C. is. Because on Twitter, after Ilhan Omar did this, you literally saw hot takes from, supposed liberals who were like, Ilhan Omar was very impolite to him. Sure, he may have done some bad things, and I don't agree with him, but she was very impolite to him, and it's unfair. Elliot Abrams was very nice to me when I fucking was an intern for him in 1998, whatever the fuck. Like, these are some tweets that people were sending out. And when I tell you they got ratioed out of existence, goodness gracious, because people were like, I do not give a fuck. Hitler was kind to dogs. Does that mean he's not a shitty person? And yes, I am comparing this dude to Hitler, because what we did during the Cold War and how we violently overthrew democratically elected governments, that's terrorism. That's the textbook definition of terrorism. Elliot Abrams is a terrorist. That's what he is. So I'm not mincing words. You can quote me on that because it's true. And everybody needs to understand that. And for people who fall into that trap of like, well, he was nice to me, and he runs in the same kind of foreign policy circles, and he's a mild-mannered guy, for you to fall into that trap, I need you to understand something. In order for you to fall into that trap, you have to buy into this working assumption, this premise. And that premise is, when we do it, we mean well, so it doesn't really count. If you have U.S. war criminals, well, we meant it with the most benign and wonderful intentions, so when we massacre civilians, when we back death squads, when we do torture, when we prop up dictators, it doesn't really count. We can never really be just the bad guys. Well, if you believe that, you're not thinking about this stuff objectively. You've just fallen into a lazy mental trap. And it's sad to see, because so many people believe that now. So many people are on that page because they've been so thoroughly brainwashed and they've so thoroughly drunk the Kool-Aid of violent empire. So credit to Ilhan Omar because she's unmasking the system here. And listen, you guys know me. I'm against identity politics, and I talk about that on a regular basis. But I can't help but conclude a little bit here that maybe it is her own personal experience as a refugee, a young Muslim woman of color, how her perspective on the world is shaped by that. And so she's kind of removed, she's been so removed from centers of power for her life that when she gets into an area of power, she brings that outsider's perspective, and she can see it from the perspective of the victims, as opposed to Elliot Abrams, who was the perpetrator, and rationalizes it in all these high-minded ways, and he thinks, I wear a suit, and I'm a respectable old white man, so obviously I've never done anything wrong. So while I'm still a critic of identity politics, because I think policy matters above all else, I do see how it can absolutely be beneficial to bring in people of all different backgrounds, because you do get, generally speaking, a different perspective when you come from a different class background, a different ethnic background, a different religious background. There are no hard, fast rules on that front because people are individuals. But you could definitely see how that may have impacted. There's a great quote. AOC tweeted it the other day. She was quoting somebody else. I think it was Ayanna Pressley, where she said, we need more people. The people who were closest to the pain need to be closer to power because they understand more. And I think that's a fair point. I think that's a fair point. It's one of the main reasons why it's absolutely unfathomable that you have, Congress and all the elites in D.C., they're almost all massively rich. So they cannot relate to the pains of a middle-class person, a working-class person. Now, by the way, that's not saying that, like, all wealthy people are fundamentally incapable of it, because there are people who are relatively wealthy, like Bernie Sanders, even though he's the poorest member of the Senate. But he's still relatively wealthy when you compare him to the rest of the United States. And he does get it, but I think the point is that broadly speaking, generally speaking, yes, we should have people of, a working-class background elected in D.C. because they are more likely to represent working people. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule. It is possible to have a poor person who's against the interests of poor people and a rich person who's for the interests of poor people. But generally speaking, I think statistically it would bear out that most of the time the person who's coming from that working class background will be more likely to represent working people. So anyway, great job from Ilhan Omar here. This was quite a sight to see. And fuck Elliot Abrams. He should be rotting in prison.